Texas, 1944. The sun had barely climbed over the horizon when the trucks rolled through the dust outside Amarillo. The engines coughed, sputtered, and died, leaving only the sound of cicadas and a low wind pushing through mesquite trees. Inside one of the trucks sat a group of German prisoners, not soldiers, but women. Their khaki uniforms were creased, their eyes hollow from weeks of transport across oceans and borders. They were met not with rifles, but with clipboards and curious eyes. Local women from the Red Cross offered water and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Someone even smiled. It made no sense. These were supposed to be enemies, women who had worn the eagle and swastika on their sleeves, and yet here they were, being greeted like guests. A few whispered to each other in disbelief. Was this some trick? Some elaborate prelude to punishment? Lizelotte's boots crunched on the dry gravel as she followed the others toward a line of barracks. The wooden buildings looked nothing like prisons. They were plain, sun-faded but neat, flowers planted along their walls, laundry fluttering in the wind. The cowboy-looking man, Lieutenant Harris, she learned later, walked beside them, tipping his hat to a passing truck driver. "You'll be safe here," he said simply, as if that were an ordinary thing to promise a captured enemy. That night, when the lights went out and the crickets began to sing, Lizelotte lay awake on a clean cot listening to the silence. No shouting, no bombs, just the soft rustle of the Texas wind through the cracks in the barrack wall. It felt impossibly distant from everything she had known. For the first time in years, she wondered if the world she had been told about, one divided neatly into good and evil, victors and villains, had ever truly existed at all. There were no chains. No shouting. Just a few soldiers leaning on their rifles, watching without malice. The cowboy handed her a tin cup of water. It was cold, cleaner than anything she'd tasted since France. She drank it all in one breath. He nodded. Plenty more where that came from. She didn't know what to say. Back home, they had been told Americans were savages, a nation of criminals and factory slaves who lived for money and machines. But here, in the soft heat of a Texas morning, nothing fit the stories. Beyond the fences, cattle drifted like clouds over the dust. Windmills turned lazily in the distance. Somewhere, a dog barked and kept barking, chasing a shadow it would never catch. The cowboy pointed toward the stables. "You folks will be helping out there, feeding, cleaning. Riding if you're up for it. Riding?" She almost laughed. She had expected shackles, not saddles. When the gates closed behind them, Lizelotte turned to look back at the endless plains. For the first time since capture, she felt something she hadn't felt in months, curiosity. She whispered to herself, half in disbelief, half in wonder. This is America. The scene fades as the narrator cuts in. She had been taught to fear a monster. Instead, she found a nation so confident it didn't need to hate its enemies, a land where prisoners were given horses, not chains. Before she ever saw Texas, Lizelotte Minhart was certain she would die in America. Every German she knew believed it. The Reich's propaganda machine had made sure of that. Posters plastered across factory walls warned that captured soldiers would be tortured, starved, or used for experiments. Radio broadcasts painted America as a land of corruption, a place where degenerate democracy had erased honor and replaced it with greed. For women like Lizelotte, the fear ran deeper. Rumors whispered through the Luftwaffe's auxiliary corps that female prisoners were sent to labor camps or worse. Officers repeated them as fact. Pamphlets described American soldiers as beasts wearing human uniforms, their cities as cages of steel and smoke. That image burned in her mind through the long voyage west, across the Atlantic's gray swells, through the dark belly of Liberty ships, past the strange quiet of the American countryside seen only through the cracks of a rail car. Each mile confirmed what she thought she knew. She was heading toward the end. But when the doors finally opened in Texas, the nightmare didn't come. No dogs, no shouting, just sunlight, dust, and the smell of hay. The guards offered food. They said please and thank you. It felt so unnatural, she wondered, if it was part of some elaborate trick, but it wasn't a trick. The United States had something the Reich never truly understood: moral confidence. By 1944, America had become the world's largest warden of prisoners, holding more than 400,000 captured Axis soldiers and civilians on its own soil. Yet instead of punishing them, the U.S. Army followed the Geneva Conventions with almost obsessive precision. Prisoners were paid small wages for their labor, allowed to write letters, attend religious services, even take English classes in camp schools. And in Texas, where the land seemed to stretch forever, they were sent to work on ranches and farms instead of rotting behind barbed wire. The logic wasn't sentimental. It was practical. America had sent millions of young men overseas, but crops still had to be planted, cattle still had to be tended, cotton still had to be picked. German POWs filled the gap, but to Liselott and the others, this practicality looked like something else entirely. Compassion. That first night, she sat on her bunk staring at a plate of food she didn't think she deserved. Beef stew, fresh bread, butter, even a slice of apple pie. She couldn't eat. She thought it was a test. Another woman whispered that the food was poisoned, but by morning, hunger overcame fear. They ate, and with each bite came a realization that felt almost impossible. The enemy they had been taught to despise was feeding them better than their own army ever had. In one of her first letters home, censored, before it could be delivered, Liselott wrote, "They told us we would be slaves. But here, even the guards say good morning. The sky was enormous, and the food tasted of mercy." For German women raised under dictatorship, the greatest shock wasn't comfort, it was dignity. America didn't need to humiliate its captives to prove its power. That quiet, unshakable confidence would soon begin to dismantle everything they thought they knew about the war. By the spring of 1944, the United States had become the largest keeper of prisoners in modern history. Across the country, more than 400,000 Axis soldiers, Germans, Italians, and Japanese were processed, fed, and assigned to labor. Texas alone held more than 70 major camps, scattered like islands across the plains from El Paso to Huntsville. Most had risen in a matter of months, identical in layout and purpose. Long rows of wooden barracks, mess halls, workshops, parade grounds. But what made these camps remarkable wasn't their design. It was their philosophy. Unlike the barbed wire brutality of Axis prisons in Europe or Asia, American POW camps were built not to crush morale, but to control it through order, discipline, and unexpected decency. The logic was coldly efficient. Each camp functioned like a small, self-contained city. There were libraries stocked with English and German books, infirmaries with clean linens and running water, and workshops where prisoners repaired uniforms and tools. Some even had orchestras and theater troupes, their music and laughter drifting beyond the fences on quiet nights. To outsiders, it looked absurdly generous. But to U.S. military planners, it was psychological warfare at its most elegant. When the War Department began receiving captured German women in 1944, mostly nurses, clerks, and auxiliary staff from the Luftwaffe, it faced a question no one had prepared for. Where do we put them? The answer was Texas. With its vast plains and endless agricultural work, it became the natural testing ground for experimental POW labor programs that could safely include women. Many arrived through Camp Hearn or Camp Swift, sprawling compounds ringed by wheat fields and mesquite. The rules were simple: obey, work, and you'd be treated fairly. Discipline brought consequences, but trust governed daily life. Their assignments mirrored the land itself. Some harvested cotton beneath the brutal Texas sun. Others sorted produce in warehouses or milked dairy cattle at dawn. They build everything like a machine that never sleeps. In time, she would see that machine up close, on the ranches, where it merged with something even more disorienting: the quiet, effortless generosity of ordinary Americans. The morning the trucks arrived, the air smelled of hay and dust. The Texas sun hung low on the horizon, slicing the plains into long bands of gold and shadow. Guards read names from a clipboard, their voices flat against the wind. Liselotte Minhart stood among 24 others, her uniform faded but precise, her posture unbroken. None of them knew what waited beyond the gates, only that they had been chosen for a new work detail, a cattle ranch somewhere beyond the wire. They braced for the worst: chains, back-breaking fields, the crack of a whip. For months, the barracks had hummed with rumors, stories of prisoners sent into the desert, swallowed by heat and silence, never to return. But when the trucks rumbled into view, reality didn't match the fear. No barking dogs. No rifles aimed from towers, just men in wide-brimmed hats and worn denim, leaning casually against their pickup trucks, dust rising around their boots. Cowboys. Real ones. Their leader, a tall rancher named Frank Callahan, greeted them with an easy grin and a lazy wave. "Morning, ladies! You all ready to work?" His drawl was so thick and unhurried that the interpreter had to repeat his words twice before anyone understood. When the trucks rolled through the ranch gates, the shock only deepened. There were no watchtowers, no fences crowned with barbed wire, only open pastures rolling toward the horizon, dotted with cattle and horses grazing beneath the vast Texas sky. The first order of business, Frank announced, wasn't punishment. It was breakfast, bacon hissed in cast-iron pans. Biscuits steamed beside bowls of fresh butter. Coffee, dark and bitter, filled the air with a scent that made the women's stomachs ache. They sat in stunned silence at a long wooden table, while ranch hands served them like guests, not captives. No guards loomed behind them. No one barked commands. Then came the next surprise. Frank led them toward a corral where several horses waited, saddled and restless. Dust hung in the morning light. "You'll be learning to ride," he said, still smiling. "Can't herd cattle on foot. We've got a drive coming up next week, and you're going to help us bring them in." A ripple of uneasy laughter passed through the group. It sounded strange, the first laughter many of them had heard in months. Lisa Lotta whispered, "He's joking," but Frank wasn't. Within minutes, the ranch hands were pairing each woman with a horse, offering instruction through a mix of broken German, slow English, and pantomime. At first it was chaos. Skirts tangled, saddles slipped, and startled cries echoed through the corral as one frightened mare bolted, dragging its rider in dizzying circles. The cowboys laughed, not cruelly but warmly, hurrying to steady the reins and help each woman back into the saddle. "Don't fight her," one drawled. "Just feel the rhythm. She'll carry you if you trust her." By noon, the women were streaked with dust and sweat, but they were laughing. Real laughter, the kind that shakes off months of fear. Under the hard Texas sun, something inside them began to thaw. For the first time since capture, they stood beyond the wire with no guards at their backs. When Lisa finally coaxed her horse into a gentle trot, she felt something she hadn't known since the war began. Freedom. Not the political kind, but the quiet, dizzying freedom of motion, of wind against her skin, of possibility whispering just ahead. That night, in the small wooden bunkhouse built for field workers, she opened her journal and wrote by lamplight, "They trust us. It is madness, but perhaps kindness disguised as madness." Lisa Lotta didn't believe him at first. None of them did. But by the end of the first week, the truth became impossible to deny. The camp trucks came only once to deliver supplies, and no one counted heads. The women could have vanished into the plains at any time, but they didn't. Why would they? Here, beneath an endless sky, they worked, laughed, and even learned. They mended fences, milked cows, stacked feed, and threw hay bales with the same precision they once applied to factory work back home. More than once, the cowboys paused to watch in quiet admiration. "Tougher than half the boys we've hired," one remarked, "and they don't complain neither." Lisa Lotta noticed something else, too. How differently the Americans seemed to value work. In Germany, labor had been duty, grim and unquestioned. Here it was pride. The men joked and sang as they worked, turning competition into camaraderie. Who could rope a calf fastest? Who could mend the longest stretch of fence before sundown? Evenings brought another kind of surprise. Instead of being locked away, the women were invited to sit by the fire, where harmonicas and guitars turned the Texas dusk into something almost sacred. At first, they sat apart, wary and silent. But music has its own kind of diplomacy. The melody softened the space between victors and vanquished. One night, when a cowboy began to hum Lily Marlene, the song every German soldier knew by heart, Lisa Lotta found herself singing before she realized it. The voices joined, imperfect but sincere, drifting upward into the dark Texas sky. For a moment, the war felt very far away. The fire crackled, voices blending, English and German, harmony and melody, until, for a few fleeting minutes, there were no enemies. Only people bound by the same tune beneath the same stars. Frank leaned back on his saddle, his tone quiet but firm. War ends sooner when folks realize they were never that different. The next morning, the work resumed, but everything felt lighter. Fear and suspicion, once so heavy, were already fading. One of the women, Anna, asked shyly if she could learn to use a lasso. The cowboys smiled and obliged, teaching her with patience and good humor. Before long, the sight of a German prisoner twirling a rope over her head drew laughter from both sides, a rare, unguarded joy. Then came the storm. A sudden wall of black clouds rolled in from the west. The wind screamed, lightning split the horizon, and the cattle panicked, scattering across the fields. Without hesitation, the women ran to help. Mounted on horses, shouting and waving, they rode alongside the cowboys, guiding the terrified cattle through sheets of rain and mud. Hours later, drenched, exhausted but triumphant, they returned together, soaked, shivering, and victorious. In that moment, the lines of enemy and ally blurred entirely. Only trust, courage, and the shared rhythm of work remained. That night, the bunkhouse was quiet, save for the soft scratch of pencils on paper. Liselotta's hand trembled as she began, "Dearest mother, I am alive, and I must tell you something you will not believe. I am working on a farm in Texas. They call it a ranch. The people here are kind. Yes, truly kind. They give us food so much that I can hardly eat it all. They even let us ride horses. The men wear hats as wide as dishes and drink something called Coca-Cola. After work, they play music and teach us their songs." She paused, staring at the words. Would her mother think she had gone mad? German propaganda had painted American camps as places of cruelty and starvation. Yet here, under the sunburned Texas sky, she drank coffee every morning and learned to make chili. She continued, her voice trembling as she wrote, "Mama, they trust us. We could run if we wanted, but we do not, because we are free in all the ways that matter. I never thought freedom could look like this." The letters were collected the next morning. Weeks later, replies came, carefully censored and filled with trembling disbelief. "Lisa, are you sure? You must be mistaken. Perhaps you are dreaming. They would never treat prisoners so well." Her mother wasn't the only one who doubted. Similar replies came to the other women. Their families, still living under ration cards and the shadow of bombing raids, could not imagine life so abundant. Hamburgers, open fields, and friendly cowboys sounded like fantasy. Even the American officers who reviewed the letters found them amusing. "Y'all are writing fairy tales," one chuckled. "Ain't nobody gonna believe you over there." But the reality was undeniable. Each day, the German prisoners rode deeper into a version of America that defied everything they had been taught. They saw it in the abundance: eggs by the dozen, meat by the pound, sugar by the sack. They saw it in the machines, tractors roaring across the fields, powered by what seemed like endless gasoline. And they saw it in the attitude: no hierarchy, no bowing, no fear. The kindness wasn't performative. It was normal. Here, under the vast Texas sky, the women began to realize something profound. This America didn't need to crush them to assert its strength. When Liselotte asked one cowboy why he treated them so kindly, he shrugged. "Lady, war's over for you when you get here. Ain't no use fighting ghosts. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something more pragmatic, an American kind of mercy, measuring worth by work, not by flag." One afternoon, a new group of POWs arrived, male soldiers from another camp. They watched in disbelief as the women led horses from the barn, laughing and chatting freely with the cowboys. "This cannot be real," one muttered in German, but it was real. For the newcomers, the sight of their comrades riding across open pastures without chains shattered years of conditioning. Slowly, tentatively, they joined the work crews. The cowboys taught them to mend fences, throw ropes, and eventually even to dance. By November, the Callahan Ranch had become something impossible, a small corner of reconciliation in a world still burning. Here, under the endless Texas sky, enemies became neighbors, prisoners became workers, and trust, fragile, hard-won, and profoundly human, began to take root. "Yes," he said, his voice steady but low. "It's done. Germany has surrendered. Hitler is dead. Europe. It's over." For a moment, the women froze. The world they had known, the one built of fear, ration cards, and whispered rumors of horror, crumbled silently in their minds. Liselotte's heart raced, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and the strange, hollow emptiness of sudden freedom. Outside, the wind stirred the prairie grass, carrying the faint smell of rain and promise. For months, they had lived in a paradox, captives yet free in ways that defied everything they had been taught. Now, the reality of the outside world, and their place in it, loomed large. Frank stepped closer, gently unfolding the newspaper. "You're not prisoners anymore, not here. Not in Texas. You've earned your trust, your work, everything you've done. The world back home will take time to rebuild, but you've already survived the hardest part." Liesl blinked back tears, looking at the horizon. The endless plain seemed wider than ever, stretching toward something she had never imagined. Possibility. "What happens now?" she whispered. Frank tipped his hat, a faint smile touching the corners of his lips. "Now you live. You work, you learn. You remember that the world can be better than the worst you've known." And for the first time in years, Liesl felt it, not just the absence of fear, but the presence of hope. A hope as vast as the Texas sky under which they stood, free to choose, free to become, free at last. The processing was methodical, almost bureaucratic in its calmness. Names were checked, papers stamped, vaccinations recorded, and transport arranged. Trains and trucks would carry them eastward, back to a country that was at once familiar and unrecognizable. The women worked alongside the cowboys until the very last day, mending fences, herding cattle, and preparing feed. There was a quiet tension in the air, a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Each knew that soon the protective expanse of Texas would give way to the ruins of Europe, to ration lines, destroyed homes, and the shadow of loss. Lisa Latta walked across the pasture one morning, feeling the dew soak her shoes. The wind carried the scent of hay and fresh soil. She paused, taking in the enormity of the open sky. Here she had discovered trust, laughter, and dignity. Here she had felt freedom in its simplest, most profound form. Could such a life exist anywhere else? She wasn't sure. That evening, as the camp lights dimmed and the cowboys strummed guitars by the fire, she wrote in her journal, "We are going back to a world that may not understand us, that may not believe what we've lived. But we carry something they cannot take, the knowledge that kindness is possible, even in a world designed for cruelty, even in war, even in captivity." The next morning, trucks arrived. The women loaded their belongings, hugged the cowboys who had become their teachers, friends, and witnesses to their survival. Lieselotte lingered, hand on the gate, staring at the horizon one last time. Frank tipped his hat and said, "Take care of yourselves. Remember what you've learned here. And remember, the world can be better if you let it." The women climbed aboard, hearts heavy but lighter than they had been in years. As the trucks rumbled across the Texas plains, Lieselotte pressed her forehead to the window and whispered, "Home. We will find it somehow." And for the first time, the idea of home felt less like a place and more like a promise, a possibility to carry, wherever they went. As the trucks rumbled across the dusty roads, Lieselotte pressed her hands against the wooden slats, eyes fixed on the shrinking panorama. The sun glinted off the windmill blades, turning them into a halo above the open fields. She could still see Frank tipping his hat, the cowboys' laughter carrying faintly in the wind, and the horses grazing lazily, oblivious to the farewells. Her heart ached with a strange mix of sorrow and gratitude. Texas had shown her a world she hadn't believed possible, a place where trust was given, not demanded, where work brought pride, not punishment, where kindness existed even amid the machinery of war. She adjusted the Stetson on her head, feeling the soft weight and the subtle curve of the brim. It was more than a hat. It was a symbol, a talisman of what freedom and dignity could feel like, even in captivity. She whispered to herself, "I will carry this with me, always." Around her, the other women shared quiet smiles, some holding small keepsakes, others wiping away tears. They had arrived as prisoners, afraid and suspicious, and were leaving as something else entirely, wiser, braver, and profoundly changed by a place that had trusted them before they trusted themselves. The horizon stretched endlessly ahead, and for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a wide, open plain waiting to be ridden. Lieselotte hugged the small parcels to her chest, savoring the strange comfort in their contents. Each chocolate bar and tin of food was a reminder of what she had learned in Texas. that generosity could exist even across enemy lines, that people could choose decency over cruelty. She looked around at the ruined city, the skeletal remains of buildings, the jagged streets, and the scattered rubble where children once played. Winter winds cut sharply through the desolation, carrying the faint smell of smoke and ash. It was a homecoming, yes, but one that demanded survival skills beyond what the war had taught her. Her fellow prisoners moved quietly, surveying what remained of their neighborhoods, searching for family or friends among the devastation. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the distant clatter of rebuilding and the murmur of conversations in hushed tones. Some women wept openly, others gritted their teeth and pressed forward, determined to find fragments of the lives they had lost. Lisa Lott felt a strange weight settle over her, a mixture of grief, resilience, and the strange, steady courage born from her months in Texas. She thought of Frank, of the cowboys, of the wide-open fields, and the trust and dignity she had been shown. That memory would sustain her, she realized, even here among ruin. This, she whispered to herself, is what we can rebuild, not just walls, but the way we treat one another. And with that, she stepped forward into the gray winter streets of a homeland that had to learn, like she had, the value of kindness amid chaos. Her words carried more than language. They carried perspective, a bridge between two worlds. In a town flattened by bombs, her stories of open fields, cowboys, and humane treatment planted tiny seeds of hope. People listened, incredulous but captivated, as she described mornings spent milking cows, afternoons riding horses, evenings around campfires filled with music and laughter. Colleagues began to rely on her not just for translation, but for insight into how ordinary Germans, especially women, perceived the Americans. She explained the profound effect of respect and trust, how it could soften fear, how dignity could survive captivity. For the occupying forces, it was a revelation. Kindness wasn't weakness, it was influence. Even as she walked through streets lined with rubble, talking with soldiers, neighbors, and other returnees, Lisa Lott felt a quiet strength within herself. She had witnessed the worst and the best of humanity, and she knew which lessons to carry forward. The Texas sun, the trust of strangers, the rhythm of work and laughter, they were her compass now. And slowly, in conversations, in small gestures, in the way she treated people around her, she began to rebuild something that bombs could not destroy. The fragile, enduring idea that humanity need not be cruel to survive. That freedom and kindness could coexist, even in the shadow of war. Her bakery quickly became more than a place to eat. It was a crossroads of memory, culture, and reconciliation. Locals came for the sweet and savory treats, but they stayed for Lisa Lotta's stories, quietly woven into the air like cinnamon and yeast. She told patrons of the wide Texas skies, of cowboys who treated prisoners with dignity, of nights around campfires where Germans and Americans sang together. Forgetting the war for a moment, children pressed their faces against the glass display, eyes wide at braided loaves dusted in sugar, never imagining the journey that had brought them there. Veterans from both sides would come in, sharing nods and quiet smiles, recognizing the healing that had taken place in a simple act. Work done with respect. Meals shared, laughter allowed. Lisa Lotta herself often paused as she kneaded dough, thinking of her younger self on the Callahan Ranch, afraid, hungry, uncertain. Now she was the one offering care, nourishment, and a gentle reminder that kindness could outlast even the deepest scars of conflict. Her life had been reshaped not by bombs or borders, but by the extraordinary human decency she had once been shown, and now passed on, one loaf at a time. The photograph, yellowed with age, captured more than a moment. It captured a story of transformation. A young woman, once a prisoner, wearing a cowboy hat far too big for her head, stood beside a tall, gentle rancher whose quiet confidence had reshaped her world. The inscription beneath, "From enemies to friends," spoke volumes about lessons learned under the endless Texas sky. Lisa Lau had carried that lesson into her life, and by the time she passed in 1987, she had become more than a baker. She was a living testament to reconciliation. Former prisoners would come through her doors, swapping stories of hardship, fear, and ultimately, the unexpected kindness that had changed their perception of an entire nation. Historians now recognize these personal experiences as a subtle but critical force in post-war healing. Thousands of former prisoners returned to their homes with tales of fairness and decency, forming the first human bridges between former enemies. The lesson was clear. Diplomacy could be codified on paper, armies could march, treaties could be signed, but the deepest healing began with simple acts of human kindness. On a Texas ranch in 1945, a cowboy had offered more than work or food. He had offered dignity, trust, and compassion. And in that quiet grace, he had won a victory no battlefield could ever claim. The greatest triumph, it seemed, was not measured in territory or surrender. It was measured in hearts changed, trust rebuilt, and humanity restored.